Hi, this is Paul. And those of you who saw the first part of this conversation, the power went out. And I just, by the way it went out, I knew it would be out for a while. And with the time difference, I thought, well, we're not going to be able to do this. So we had some time today, and Martin had some time today. And we were just talking about the fact that actually it's kind of nice to have a pause in the middle because we can come back and chew on some of the stuff that we talked about and develop it further. I want to part of what we talked about quite a bit was the emergence of orthodoxy in the West in this moment right now, and it's clearly meeting a certain hunger and a desire that's in the West right now. You, Martin, are an interesting fellow in this because you are, as we all are of our age, a product of what we went through. You took a very different turn, as we spoke about. You went to the wilderness, but you didn't go to the wilderness to be a monk. Or, well, let's talk about why you went to the wilderness because I don't. Well, first, maybe we should make good on what you were going to say about Paul Kingsnorth because that was the cliffhanger, and then maybe
Yeah.
we'll go from there.
Well, it's a compliment to Paul, I'm pleased to say. So, Paul, forgive me, I think I said he was a Saxon. He's either a Saxon or a Viking or a mix. And they tend to think of their long ships moving through the water. There's a certainty to the direction of that ship. There is the waves move back, there's space, there's clarity. Even the way that the Nordic peoples use metaphor, it's very different to a Celt. Celts, you could say, rather like Plotinus, they favor the circle. They
Hmm.
favor the circle. Even our boats, our currachs, are small little things that we are, as Blake would say, crooked roads without improvement. We're not like the way. We're
Right.
crooked roads without improvement. But God made us too, and we're different. But one of the things I really admire about Paul's writing actually is the structure of it. The fact that I can see he was a journalist at one point. I
Yeah.
can see that he can get to the quick of something and he can hold your attention there. And I'm just a different kind of animal.
Yeah.
I'm not better or worse. I'm just different.
Yeah.
And mercifully, you don't have to choose.
No. No.
Isn't that wonderful? My dad always said in life, unless you absolutely have to, don't choose things. Enjoy. There's always an and an or, and there's
Yeah.
a bobbing and weaving in the Christian life, to be honest. If
Yeah.
you've got half a heart and you've been in this for more than a decade, you're going to have to become accommodating. Forgive me if I said this in the last episode, but it's so wonderful. I have to pass it on. Rowan Williams said to me, he said, if you have a strong center, you can have a fuzzy edge.
Yes. Yes. And that's another one of these, Martin. Well, you stole it from someone else. I'm going to
I
steal it from you.
given, yeah, I was given. I didn't steal it, but I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I think you said in Galway, all preachers are magpies, and we're all like that. And I think on that note, the unofficial god of the storytellers before Jesus is Hermes. I don't mean raised above Jesus. I just mean historically,
Yeah.
mythically. Now, the thing about Hermes is people always say, "Oh, he's a god of the liars. He's the god of the liars." He isn't. He's a god of imagination, and Hermes never ever wants to con you. What he wants to do is collude in the mischief of imagination. So when he's being fantastical, he winks. And in the wink, there's a message soul to soul that we are both enjoying what the Mexicans call the river underneath the river, the
Hmm.
story that works without the use of facts. So, actually, funnily enough, the notion of a magpie gathering things in, I think we all realize at some point in our life, yes, occasionally we get inspiration beamed directly into us, but we are also moving around with today, I am under the influence of my friend Charles Foster because I've been talking to Charles Foster, or this is going on. And I think that that is a natural and actually quite a sort of humble way of being in the world. If you get something interesting, pass it on.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you should mention Hermes. I don't know if you know. Do you know anything about John Verveke?
John, no, I know I like his trainers, his sneakers. And I like Verveke in those round table discussions. Sort of, he's my kind of guy. He's like the Anthony Bourdain, if you know who that is. The
Yes.
chef. He's kind
Yes.
of punk. There's not enough. There's something slightly disruptive about the way his mind works that I find very attractive.
Okay. So I, started making Jordan Peterson was doing his biblical series. I just kind of I wanted to make a couple friends. I thought YouTube would give me a couple friends because that's all the internet had ever given me is one or two things. And instead it brought me thousands of new friends, which was a little disruptive. But so two of the friends that I made along the way were Jonathan Pageau and John Verveke, and both of these individuals are friends of Jordan Peterson. And John Vervaeke's story, it's out there on the internet in many different places. He was raised in Canada in a fundamentalist group, sounded dispensational, a lot of anxiety about the rapture and the unforgivable sin. And when he turned 18, he left all that and went to university and studied Taoism and Buddhism and eventually cognitive science. Do you know what internal family systems is?
I can make a very good guess, even though I've never heard of it before. But
Okay.
please say more.
So internal family systems is a new technique in psychology today, where you know it began with a psychologist who was doing family systems because someone is deeply troubled, and you begin to realize as a psychologist, pastors of course always knew this, you begin to realize as a psychologist that the whole story is not sitting in the room in this chair in front of you. There's a mom and a dad and a grandma, and there's all these other things. And so family systems began bringing other members of the family into the psychological space to have the conversation to begin to sort of take apart that tangle. Well, one of these family system guys began to notice that I think what Jonathan Pageau, I think, was really helpful in sort of helping the world see that there are family systems inside of us as well. All of us are, to one degree or another, we are legions inside
Yeah,
as well as outside. And
yeah,
so what this family system psychologist began doing was having people sort of have them relax, meditate, just sort of to, turn down the chattering mind, and began talking to some of the subpersons within the person. And this has been one of the more popular elements of psychology around right now. And they've seen a certain amount of results. Well, John Vervaeke, over the last number of years, Jonathan Pageau and I have been having a variety of conversations with John Vervaeke. And part of the reasons because of our backgrounds, Jonathan Pageau and I are far more open, aware of persons and agents that are non-human, powers and
yeah,
principalities, spirits, all of this. And John Vervaeke was always rather skeptical because he's a cognitive scientist. He is a scientist. He had deconstructed. He was post-Christian. He was post-Buddhist. He was very skeptical about this. And then John began getting involved in internal family systems work and was doing that. And one day, as he was sort of having conversations with the various persons within his person, an entity came forward and pushed them all away and said, "Now you're going to talk to me." And he said, "Who are you?" And the entity said, "I'm Hermes." And that got his attention. And then, he's been talking to Hermes. He sort of likened it because John talks to and John may watch this video, so I hope I'm repeating all of this fairly. There's plenty of it on the internet if you're curious about investigating it any further. Hermes said something, and basically John asked Hermes, "Well, why are you here?" And Hermes said something to the effect of, "I'm going to bring you back to Christianity," which was interesting. And of course, in the little community that I have been working on online, which is full of all sorts of people, Orthodox, Catholic, post-Christians, non-Christians, people who are fascinated in whatever. Of course, that got everybody's attention and has been, part of our conversation. And, what you just said now about Hermes was so interesting in that light because I remember when I heard John say this, and then I had a conversation with him to follow up on it a little bit more because I was curious because of all of all the names with which you could engage. And I think part of the key thing that caught my attention here was John, who had been quite skeptical of the kinds of conversations we have with agents and persons that don't have skin wrapped on them like we do. I thought Hermes was a particularly interesting name to that one would give themselves in an exchange like this, and especially then setting it up as they have. So I don't know if that draws anything out of you. It certainly doesn't have to,
Oh,
but
well, I mean, to be honest, we could just go now for several hours, but I won't. But if you know, John, just if he ever wants to talk to a mythologist about Hermes, I'd love to do that. And
oh,
I've worked in Crete telling Hermean stories. I've told stories in the valley that Hermes erupts from, just behind the mountain where Zeus is born. So I'm familiar with that kind of thing. I told the Odyssey for 5 straight days and then went and told the birth of Hermes, where he was born, where a series of extraordinary events then took place. But that's for another day. Let's think about Hermes for a minute. Hermes is the god that speaks out of both sides of his mouth. Hermes is the god of the hinge. Hermes is the god of the storytellers. Here's a lovely idea about Hermes. If you have a question and you go to a Hermean temple, which is usually in a marketplace, you ask the question, you turn, you walk away, and the first thing you hear is the answer.
hmm,
So it could come from a child. If it comes from a derelict or a tramp, even better. It could be the squawk of a bird, but usually the first human contact is Hermes speaking to you. But here's the thing about Hermes. Hermes can only communicate from soul to soul. So, in other words, there is always a sense that he traffics in depth. He traffics in a movement of the heart. He traffics in a movement of the soul. So even though people say we live in a Hermean age, what we're doing now is Hermean in a way through the wonders of the internet. Actually, Hermes is a deeper character. And the first thing that Hermes does when he's born is create a musical instrument. You were talking to me in our last interview about what happens, when orality becomes literature or music becomes something that you write down.
yeah,
Hermes happens when wit is present. So a character that is really simpatico with Hermes would be Jordan Peterson. That pacing he does, the
yeah,
pacing,
yeah,
the up and
yeah,
down,
yeah,
that is very high wire philosophical acrobatics. And it's a place where book learning hits something else entirely. And when he was at his most dynamic, he is from a one way of looking at it, he is Hermes has him at that moment. And now, look, all you fundamentalist Christians, don't go running to the hills when I say that. That doesn't mean he's possessed by a malevolent spirit. It's a metaphor, but it's a very beautiful one. And as all metaphors do, they have a multitude of meanings. So, actually, Hermes choosing to communicate is an invitation to wit, to spontaneity, to music. It's not a bad figure to have around. And actually, Hermes, again, your comments are going to be filled with people taking me to task over this, but Hermes is not Bacchus. Hermes is not Dionysus. Hermes is it's an intermediary being. Again, here we go, upsetting everybody. He's an Elohim.
Right. Yeah.
That's what he is.
Yeah.
And for a long time he has been my faithful companion. I just say that as a figure of
Yeah.
speech, really. I felt, because most storytellers ironically are frightened of Hermes, because the only thing Hermes says is burn your script. That's what Hermes says. He says no notes. No notes. Remember when Jesus says, now go out,
Yeah.
don't plan a thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
just off you go. That's what they call a Hermean move. It's a Hermean move, and it is dangerous, and it's exciting, and it's filled with life. So I'm not surprised. What I get from Verviki is a sense of restlessness.
Yes. Yes.
He's not, my beloved, one of my beloved figures is the Bishop Baron. I got a lot of love for the Bish. He activates my need for benign authority, male authority figures. I sort of relax in his company. But for every Bish, forgive me, every Bishop, Robert Barron, who I wish was about to become the Pope, by the way, for every Bish, you need a Vervaki, because he's a little bit of a trickster. And here's the thing about tricksters. Tricksters can only function when an authority figure is in the room. If there's no authority to push against, then the trickster cannot function. The anti-hero needs the hero, in a way. So anyway, that's just a little something about Hermes. But the stories of Hermes, his relationship to the rest of the gods, it's really, really fascinating. But you asked me about why did I go into the wild?
Yes.
And I'd like to respond to that. Firstly, only this morning I would have been conversing with Kingsnorth Paul about this,
Yeah.
and we were talking about what constitutes prayer, because there's a notion in Orthodoxy that to fast without prayer is almost demonic. That you could loosen yourself to a point where all sorts of spirits of evil influence are coming on you. But actually, prayer for me, I find one of the extraordinary redemptive things about God is God sees into your secret damaged heart, even if you don't have a name yet for what you are. And I've been praying forever. And as Lewis would say, I was baptized in my imagination when I went out into the woods for 4 years. And over the years, that has grown into this experience that I'm having now. Also, to go back to a phrase you just used, legion. Now, I am legion, of course, we understand that. In poetry, Walt Whitman says, I contain multitudes.
Yeah.
I contain multitudes.
Yeah.
And I prided myself long before, God really knocked on my door in the way we understand him with that Whitman line. But when I became a Christian and when I entered Orthodoxy, I began to have to ask the question, am I legion? Is this not actually as sexy as I once thought? Is there all sorts of damage dragging itself, half dead figures? You will know. Do you remember the image of Camelot and the Round Table?
Yeah.
Arthur and the Knights
Yeah.
of the Round Table. I had a dream once where my own round table was half dead. It was like the night after an awful party, and there's a vulture sitting where Gawain should sit, and then there's just beer everywhere, and there's a heartbroken woman wailing at a wall. And I recognized in a similar way to the Verveke illustration you gave that my interior was very wounded. And then, funnily enough, I had a dream. I had a dream that I was in the First World War, and I was in the trenches, and I had been wounded, but I wasn't admitting it. I tried to do the wound myself, and it was underneath my coat. And my captain was standing next to me, who I immediately recognized as Yeshua.
Mm.
And he said, what have you got under your coat? And I said,
Mm.
nothing. No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. And he said, let me look under the coat. And he said a very tender thing to me. He said, you've been very hurt.
Mm,
and you've done a tremendous job of trying to tie your own arm up.
mm,
And he said, I can fix it for you, but I will have to hurt you to do it.
yeah.
Are you ready? And in the last days of my 49th year, I said, I'm ready. And if it hurt, it only hurt for an instant. So anyway, much as a much younger man, I went out into the woods because actually I was disillusioned with the world in a very in a very orthodox sense of it. I mean, I do have to say, don't tell anybody, but Christianity doesn't come from the desert. It comes from this place called Jerusalem. Just so we're clear. And just another point, love it though I do, Mount Athos is not orthodoxy, it's part of orthodoxy. And just to be absolutely clear, desert ascetics are not part of the normative Christian life that most Orthodox people explain. And I worry a little bit with that wonderful blast of desert energy. We just need to situate it in a wider journey that I think is in danger of getting lost because it's so exciting, especially to younger folks. So I was in the woods and around the woods for 4 years. I had no phone, no screen, no nothing. That's no great achievement of mine though, because this was in the previous century. It wasn't a thing. I didn't. There was
Yeah.
nothing to miss.
No.
There was nothing to miss.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but that is when I had been through a series of experiences that were so extraordinary in my early fasts on the hill. I had encounters with, you know, enormous supernatural presences that I had no words for. Not malevolent, not evil, just otherly.
Yeah.
That's the thing, you see. There's a lot the Bible says, and there's a few things the Bible doesn't talk about much.
Yeah.
But you read the very beginning of Genesis, and it's quite a strange picture. And where I come from, with our tradition, I'm afraid of words like fairy, what we call down here, we call them the Benji. In Ireland, we call them the She or the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the hill. It's not just sort of Victorian psychodrama. Like there are things in the woods. And if you are frightened of nature and you've decided that it is incredibly corrupted, you're going to view those things as evil, especially, to be honest, if you're reading accounts of monastics having very aggressive experiences with spirits. But I do have to say, after now 3 decades, I have spent thousands of nights on my own in the wild, under canvas or just under trees, in a myriad of situations. And I've been out there where the buses don't park, and I've seen some strange things, but not once have I come across anything that was malevolent.
Hmm.
I've come across things that are not human,
Hmm.
and you should just tip your hat and keep walking. Just tip your hat and keep walking. My friend Malcolm Guite would say the same thing, but that's not the same thing as assuming they have a whiff of sulfur about them.
Yeah. There's so many things that touches on. So my, it's funny. Before I came across Jordan Peterson, Dreer was my gateway drug.
Yeah.
And I continue to read Rod, lately daily again. For a while, I wasn't reading him as often, but now I'm reading him again. And Rod just wrote his book, Living in Wonder. And as I think we've lived in a strange, um, I think we've lived in a strange pause in history of modernity sort of pulled reality. So before I was heading off into the mission field to work with Haitians, and before that Brazilians, I was conscientious young man, started to do some reading, and you begin to understand what missiologists had been writing about in terms of the excluded middle. That part of what had happened in the world was that everything is heaven and hell. everything is, and that means that all of the creatures in the middle were sort of wrung out of everything. And of course, missionaries going from the UK or from America would go out into Africa or Latin America or many other strange places and begin to say, there are all sorts of creatures, and creatures is the right word. They are created beings. There are all sorts of creatures here that are not on our map. And what is happening now is that in a strange way, as the wilds of the internet, as the wilds of life beyond the moon, as the wilds of God's broader creation start to come rushing back, Christians are going to have to figure out how to live in this noisier world. And I think what you just described is helpful. Yet, I was I just finished reading the book Vatican One because both in terms of trying to understand what's happening in this Orthodox moment and trying to figure out what on earth the Roman Catholic Church is, I I thought, well, Catholicism, because I had first read a couple of books about Pius the XI and Pius the XII during the Second World War, and come to understand that democracy was evil, and Mussolini for Pius the XIth didn't quite trust him, but he really hoped that Mussolini could work well with the papacy because they'd lost their papal states, and hoping that they could make Catholicism great again. And of course, Mussolini didn't work out real well. Franco, that was interesting. And Hitler was just a catastrophe right from the start, even though he's from Catholic Austria. And so, of course, in the 20th century, then with Vatican II, the Catholic Church has to pivot again because suddenly they need the democracies, they need the Americas. And then, as this book is weaving through the legacy of Vatican I, it was so interesting because one of the things that after the Pope lost all of his temporal power over the papal states is the temporal power that he had had through his relationships with monarchs and emperors. Ironically, in some ways, the Pope became more powerful. And just as I was waiting for you to come on, of course, we have, just like sportscasting, and Bishop Barron was right there,
Yeah,
live
yeah,
play-by-play as we go into
yeah,
the conclave. And what was interesting was that even as in Vatican I, the papacy tries to, it declares infallibility, primacy, and not everyone is convinced. In some ways, the papacy has more primacy because of the tools of modernity. And I think about this with respect to, so two of the biggest alarmists that I read are Orthodox. They're Rod Dreher and Paul Kingsnorth, and I read them, faithfully. And Rod is rather alarmist about, on one hand, he's saying reenchantment is coming, but he's also very anxious about, let's say, unauthorized spirits, we'll say it that way, or unauthorized Elohim or unmapped Elohim.
yeah,
And Paul, of course, is very anxious, and rightly so, about the machine.
yeah,
But, and this is part of the reason why I've appreciated a lot of what you've been writing about the desert, the we're dealing with elements that are, as this amazing image that comes from Uncle Remus, a tar baby. In that in Vatican I, as Pius the Ninth attempts to destroy modernity, or at least preserve the church from it, he unwittingly is just, the press begins to rise in the 19th century. Of course, once photography comes into play, you have pictures of the Pope in every good Catholic place. You have Suddenly now the papacy, whereas in the 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th century, if you weren't terribly ecclesiastically plugged in, the Pope was almost nothing compared to your local bishop or your local church. And so we're in this moment when technology, the machine, it's like a tar baby. People try to fight it and they discover that they're, once you touch it, and it's in some ways we're at many points like that right now. And as I watch Orthodoxy, where would these hundreds, who knows the numbers, would these many young men be streaming into Orthodox churches without the tar baby of the internet? And whereas in some ways, for all
Mm.
sorts of reasons, Orthodoxy was shielded from so much of the machine for
Yeah.
so long. And now it's almost, I wonder if to some degree the machine isn't sort of a novel virus for the Orthodox immune system. That, to what degree has it, and that's a blessing for the church now, because I see Orthodoxy coming in some ways like a virgin, like a maiden, like an innocent. But in other
Yeah.
ways, she's coming into a very worldly space with the machine. So there's a little rant for you. I'm really
It's a,
curious
no,
to take off with
it's a,
that.
yeah, that's a wonderful riff, and it landed in two or three very interesting places. Um, let me just just say a few very simple things about my own experience of what I think orthodoxy is. I think for anybody that's really a lifer, orthodoxy just becomes the place where you live. It is just the place where you live. It's that very old Christian idea of, a follower of the way. Uh, it is asceticism. Asceticism is part of orthodoxy, but it's not the whole thing. But in an emergency like 2025, the response is going to get more and more extreme, you see, to the tar baby. So orthodoxy, something that, is certainly not an experience of the Enlightenment. We haven't had one. We're the Endarkenment. We're the we're very open. That is one of the great things about the Orthodox experience. You think it's rules all over the place, and you get in, and it's colossally mysterious, and nobody's trying to tidy that up particularly. So interestingly, artistically, it's much more spacious than it looks from the outside. What else would I want to say? The liturgy comes from the choreography of Second Temple Judaism. A decent Orthodox is just trying to be a good Jew.
Yeah, yeah.
We're trying to be a good Jew who has experienced grace. That's paraphrasing in our talk of passing. And that really comes from my friend Charles Foster. So I'm sort of that, but now it came from me and it's going to be from you in about an hour. We're all trying to be good Jews. And the aesthetic thing gains traction in the third century, and it has a lot of the Neoplatonic in it, and it's not without merit. And I think there's a reason why orthodoxy, the formality of it, it seems radically different and from a distance far more uncorrupted than some of the models we've worked with recently. It feels like you're going to get something didactic. It feels like you're actually going to get some instruction, and you do. But even within that instruction, because in the end it's not about the church, it's about God. It's not about, sorry, I get animated at this point. Churches, I have been through a million of them. You have. They are fallible things full of fallible creatures called human beings. But the way of the church, not just the church as a sort of fucked up institution, I still have time for it. I have to have time for it. And I can see why it's going to be Orthodoxy's moment. And I think people are ringing the alarm bells. Rod is one of them. Paul is one of them. I tell you what, though, I'll name someone else who you know extremely well. Another voice that's different tonally to them is our friend Pageau.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a smile on Jonathan's face,
Yeah.
and Jonathan can terrify you. Jonathan will tell you how to go to hell, but you'll say, "Well, where do I get a ticket?" You know, that's part of I'm only here to encourage all
Yeah.
my friends. You know,
Yeah.
that's what I'm about. But Peugeot, he's very Hermean. Jonathan is amazing on his feet. We did a thing together at Cambridge University once, and that's the world that I live in. But you know, he bounced back. You know, he bounced back. He'll have his things. So Peugeot is, I think, a good doorway. He's very unhysterical,
Yeah.
but he can talk about myth. He can talk about the supernatural. He can talk about 2025. He has amazing amount of knowledge in him. And Jonathan, and I'd want to Richard Rollin, who I think you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. I know Richard Taylor.
and Father Andrew Damick and people like that.
Yeah.
They are part of this tremendously creative conversation that's now
Yeah.
going on between Christians that, as you were saying, are accommodating the disturbances of 2025
Yeah.
and saying, okay, well, if Augustine is right, if all truth is God's truth, what are the pinpricks of eternity we see in these other myths and stories? And I would imagine that's why God decided to chuck me into the mix at this particular point.
Well, let's talk about this tar baby of technology and especially the internet, because the internet is particularly tar baby-ish because it is, I mean, it is text could
Yeah.
grab some things, but the internet, especially version 2, but with video and with AI, with the internet is just collecting everything. And there's something deeply troubling about that. And it
Yeah.
is troubling almost
Yeah.
all of the other creatures that we have come
Yeah.
accustomed to in our modern world.
Yeah. Now, in Tibet, there's a story called Sticky Hair. There's this demon called Sticky Hair. And if you fight Sticky Hair, you just get stuck to the thing. Sticky Hair is the Tibetan tar baby. It's a
Yeah.
very, very old myth. And until you sit down with Sticky Hair in a perfect lotus position and say, what ails you? Just like you do with the Fisher King, you get
Hmm.
nowhere as long as you fight it. Now, here's a word you're probably familiar with this, but it's in Greek, the pharmakon. And the
Yep.
pharmakon is the poison and the remedy at the
Yep.
same time. Myth never deals in one thing. It always deals in and or, and it's not a black and white affair. Um, I always say that Jesus Christ speaks a blue feather language, and people say, "Well, what does that mean?" And I say, "Well, look at a magpie. There's a black feather, there's a white feather, but tucked in the tail is the blue one." And those Cohen-like parables he uses, or when he arrives in Jerusalem, in the Gospel of John, and it suddenly gets mythological and massive. Before Abraham, I am. He just will not. He's very rarely didactic in that way.
Yeah.
We have a very slim bit of Jesus that we can cope with, and then there's all the weird stuff around the sides. So, in other words, what I'm getting to with the Pharmacon is that I'm not going to be just so we know, I'm not throwing my laptop into a lake anytime soon. I may do, but the Amish move is for me to deny a kind of wrestle that I think I'm meant to have, which is to do actually with discipline. It's just to do with the fact that you go, do you know what? On Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I am simply not online,
Yeah.
and I'm online for 3 hours. It's an invitation to limit. I'm always saying, make a covenant with limit, which is an old Christian idea, for goodness sake, and then you can enjoy things more.
Yeah.
But when it gets too extreme, and I talked to this chap I probably mentioned before, Malcolm Geit, who you
Yeah.
should talk to. He's amazing, mind like a prairie, Malcolm. It just goes on and on and on. But he would be the same. He'd say, as soon as you are just retreating to the desert and that's it, you've lost you've lost some of the invitation to life. It's not as if the desert fathers were not Gnostic. They weren't. It's not Gnosticism. But if you're not careful and you don't have the cradle of something like Christianity around you, it's going to breed that because you are so far out now where the buses don't park. Anyway, thought for the day.
No, that's helpful. That's helpful. And I think it's in keeping with the other theme that you have. One of when I'm looking at the Orthodox moment now, and I very much celebrate their moment. It's sort of like when you come into a home and someone has had a child, they've had a baby, and it's just, it's time to celebrate. In the back of your head as a parent and maybe a grandparent, oh, you have no idea what you've just brought into the house.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way of putting it. That's a brilliant way of putting it. Yeah, I have 53 years living in a Christian home with really lovely. The image I always have, people say, well, do you think one of the phrases I have something of an allergy to, but I kind of confess to being one if you really feel, is the notion of being a mystic. Because it's just so highfalutin, as if Christianity isn't mystical enough for all of us already, for goodness sake. Psh,
Yeah.
have a look at the Passion. Have a look at Gethsemane. Have a look at crossing the Kedron. Have a look at the supreme poetic event of our time, which is the crucifixion. That's going to melt all of us.
Yeah.
The image that I have of being a Christian is being a worker bee. I know it's so tiny, it's like a little bit. And I see that, and I want you to receive this. I see that in you, and I
Mm,
love that in you. And that's why I value our friendship,
mm.
because I saw you at uh, that rather complex experience called Ark. And I thought, amongst because you're a tall man, you're heroic of stature, you can be spotted. You could be spotted. But amongst the amount of deal making that was going on and the goats that were being led to slaughter and all the money lending that was going on at that place, there's this guy in a corner just enduring conversation after conversation after conversation in a really good way. So I salute you. You're a rare thing.
Oh, thank you.
Keep going.
Well, and when I in the distortion field of the internet that I inhabit, everybody is going Orthodox.
Really.
Everybody. But then when I get out into the normie world,
Oh yeah.
I just travel around and there's church here, church here, church here. And then I look at all of the people that have no connection to a church, but they're all plugged into this machine and the internet is sort of tweaking all of them or tweaking half of them. They're to our blessing, there are a good many sane people that just go to work every day and don't have time to listen to so much of the foolishness that is making the world crazy. Yet my um my anxiety is my anxiety is for all the other normal, oh, banal, mundane, um, inept, regular, sleepable churches in the world that are the ones that are actually accessible to the vast majority of human beings. And, to the person that can find a lovely Orthodox priest and a lovely communion or, or a lovely church of whatever tradition they came out of that feeds their soul and heals their wound. I certainly again celebrate with them. But in terms of the scale needed, it's so interesting to me because there's, of course, this one moment in the gospel where Jesus pauses and looks out and says, as did the prophets, looks at the hills and says they're like sheep without a shepherd. And then he tells the fields are white. and he sends his disciples, his hapless, you know, I love the image of the disciples in the Gospels. They're just so hapless, clueless, inept. And he sends them out, and he's so I send you out like sheep among wolves. And I find Christians hear that in their warm, cozy church, and oh, isn't that a lovely pastoral image? Because none of them have ever stumbled across a blood drenched fleece in the middle of a wilderness and understood that, oh, the thing that ate that might eat you too.
Yeah.
And so I celebrate this moment on the internet, but I really pray for just the multitudes out there
So do
that
I.
have so little that they can find.
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking, which leads me to my new book.
Oh, wow.
I don't think we've ever discussed this.
We've never
I have a book coming out with Penguin.
really.
Yeah, yeah. You see, I'm the soul of modesty. I've no, I've been too busy writing it for the last couple of years, but it's called Liturgies of the Wild: The Myths That Make Us, and it's written for you basically, and it's written for your readership. It's saying we live in alarming, strange, what I would call initiatory times, but we've lost the braille to be able to decipher them. You know, braille when you're
Yeah.
blind. We're sort of incapacitated in a certain way. So the book tells the story of my rather dramatic experience of Christ in the forest 5 years ago, where that has led me through orthodoxy, but at the same time there's a door open all the way through saying actually Christianity that is pungent and smells nice and stays with you is essentially mythic, not mythic like a fiction, but mythic as the most profound sense of truth. And so the book is divided up. It's unusually focused for me. And so I'll have a chapter which is on death, on sex, on passion, on passivity, on betrayal, all the way through, you know, 11 sermons really.
Mm.
And it's a little it's I tell you what it is. Do you know the wooden horse in the Iliad that goes into Troy? It's a wooden horse that is for the times that we're in, and it's filled with good things. So I'll be busy. It comes out at the beginning of next year, but every single decent idea I've ever had is in this book. It's a kind of a gathering
Mm.
in of the last 30 years of work, but on the one hand, I'll be telling, the story of Job or Joseph out in the underworld of Egypt. But on the other, I could be talking about Hermes.
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of thing that might have been even regarded as an anathema 5 years ago is about to become extremely useful for some people. Like you, my heart goes out not to, our fairly, creatively stimulated group of friends. I'll be in Canada tomorrow. I'm about to go to Canada. And you have this experience in North America that we don't have here, where there's so much space, churches just get abandoned. And then you go 50 yards, then there's another version. Over here, we've got so little, we're always recycling. We recycle our churches, but there's this tremendous sense of sort of absence. At the moment, the Church of England doesn't have a leader.
Yeah.
The Catholics don't have a leader.
Yeah.
That is it's sort of fascinatingly strange.
Yeah.
And like you, I've been watching my dear Bishop Barham doing, here we are. It's late at night, and I'm hoping for a quiet pope. I hope the next pope doesn't say a word. You know what I mean? I've literally he said it in a much more nuanced way. Now, the thing about Bishop Barron, I just have to say that's so terrific, is how philosophically erudite he is. He understands myths. He's got a bit of Irish in him, which is always a thumbs up where I come from. So I like, as I said, talking across the fence. But there are friends of mine that say, listen, if you can't find it in Maximus the Confessor, you can't find it. And I also get Orthodox coming up at the end of an evening. It'll happen to me in Canada, and they'll say, why are you tickling the devil's beard with these myths and fairy tales you
Yeah,
tell?
yeah,
Why would you
yeah,
do that?
yeah,
Why would
yeah,
you do
yeah,
that? And so mercifully, that didn't stop Tolkien. It didn't stop Chesterton. It didn't stop Lewis. It didn't stop the English or the British mythopoetic tradition that I
yeah,
come from. But I get it in the neck from everybody, Paul.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely everybody.
I
Yeah.
believe it. I believe it. Well, talk to me more about, and this is for me. So my church is so funny. So we hadn't had a financial report for our bookkeeper for 6 months. And so, it's making me a little nervous every time you bring the paycheck to the bank. It's like, and then finally we got financial reports yesterday, and it was like, all right, all right. And so then it's like, well, we'll have to see what we'll have to see what comes over. I've got certain number of years until the pension starts, and it's like, and so then I think, I've been doing this internet thing for a few years now, and I think often I would really like to I would really like to sit down and write, because writing is different a different thing than speaking. And I'm naturally scattered. And so I'm really encouraged to hear because it sounds like you've sort of been able to gather all those cats.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Talk to me about how you do this, because I think sometimes I'd like to gather a few of my herd some of my cats, but I have no idea where to start. So I know some people say they have an hours during the day. Some people say they tell me about how you herd your cats to come up with something as as challenging as and I think as helpful as this book sounds, at least so far.
Um, well, it's like anything in life. If you do it a lot, it becomes something that's second nature for me. And writing helps me figure out what I think. It just helps me figure out what I think. And it's interesting because you haven't really seen me in action yet. You haven't seen that. And you'll understand me in a different way when you do. But but when people have the experience of me talking in a room with them, that tends to become like the predominant, they'll never forget that thing.
Yes,
And when
yes,
and when
yes,
I'm dead and on my grave, I know it'll say, "Here lies a storyteller."
yes.
However, what I actually do all day is write. I
Hmm.
write. And writing is not a discipline I think I was immediately good at. There's no evidence of it at school, particularly, but it's become something. As I said, now I'm like 17 books in, proper thick, you know, thick tomes. I've got them all around me. Probably, I'm much better known as a writer
Hmm.
than I am anything else. Now, okay, so first of all, outside of this internet thing that we're doing at the moment, I'm really happy. I can definitely help, just confident, between us, because I would just suggest when in the day, as men of a certain age, when are you most awake? When are
In the
you most
morning.
awake? In the
In the
morning.
morning.
Okay, so what you need to do then is clear the schedule between, if you possibly can, between about 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock. About 8 and 11. I'm a fan of coffee. I don't remember if you drink coffee or not. No, I remember this. You're incredibly, you're more orthodox than anybody. There's no you can't slip a Guinness into Vanderclay. You can't get the coffee at him. All right, whatever you need to wake up in the morning, have a period of time where you write. Most importantly, do not wait till you are inspired.
Hmm.
You just have to start. To speak mythologically for a moment, your muse is most impressed by fidelity. And so you just have to keep showing up. You have to kind of have a place set apart in your house. For me, very important when I write, no views. I don't want to see the garden. I don't want to see anything. I'm a low stimulus individual. So go to a place probably where you're facing the wall, or you can see very, very little around you. Don't, whatever you do, don't start putting icons up all over the place. Just look at the wall and just start to write. And you'll find that out of 10 sentences you write, one has a little sort of jump of imagination that the others don't have.
Hmm.
Get rid of them. However, in the mornings, don't do a lot of editing. Don't immediately start hacking away at it. It's a bit like preparing your sermons.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
kind of come at it a few times during the week and then you
yep,
deliver.
yep.
Well, you need to find when are you most creatively buoyant and you start to write. And then for me, after I've had a nap, I'm one of these guys, I sleep every afternoon. Once I've slept, I go back, and not a lot is going to happen between me and you from about 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock. The day has revealed itself. I'm now jaded, slightly depressed. Good time to edit. So I come in and I often edit at a different desk. I even move around the house
Hmm.
and I look at it impassively as if somebody else wrote it, as if it's a student of mine. I've done a lot of academic work and I just go through it and snip and snip and snip. But I like to be surprised. One of the things I always say is that in every decent book, there's a secret in it that even the author doesn't know. And when you don't know, when there is no secret, you've got a pamphlet, not a book. You've got a mission statement, not a thing that's alive. Books that are really good, I put them down in one part of the house, and when I go back, the book has moved. The book is alive. The book has agency. So that's the initial thing that I'd say is don't be too critical of what you're doing.
Hmm.
Work in the mornings, and then if you can come back to it either in the evening or at some other point where you're in a very sober frame of mind and begin to edit, and also have two or three people around you that are going to read it not uncritically, but you trust them and they have your best interests at heart and they keep responding. What you could do is what my old mentor Robert Bly used to do. He wrote a book called Iron John. It was huge, sold 2 million copies. Robert, every few weeks, was working on a chapter and he'd say, and tonight in Minneapolis, Girard Avenue South, 7 o'clock, I'm going to read the chapter.
Hmm.
And then a lot would happen, a lot of rewrites would happen with his small little congregation.
Hmm.
And then he goes back to the desk. And I suspect with a guy like you, the push and pull, I see it in the
Yeah,
comments that you have.
yeah,
These are real conversations.
yeah.
That's a very healthy way to live. Now, on this point, somebody that is really unpublished in any real way at the moment is Jonathan Pageau.
Yeah.
Jonathan Pageau is an extraordinary example. It's a wonderful example of how God is working right now. Doesn't have any academic credentials, doesn't have any pieces of paper, doesn't have, he's an icon carver and a good listener. And that guy is class in a glass, as we say over here. He's just in the right spot. And I love the fact that he and others who are great communicators have slipped through the net of the old boy network and found their way in these really hot spots. But I was saying to Jonathan the other day, because, he could get a book deal, I was saying, unless you have a real voice as a writer, do be aware that we are absorbing information in a very different way these days. That's why I did Substack, because a lot of people simply don't have the stamina to get to the end of a book anymore. However, for me, there is a joy. There's just something so substantial, so dignified about working on a book that I can only encourage it. But I do know the way we absorb information has radically changed
Yeah.
in the last 20 years.
Yeah. Well, two things. First, I'd like to know more particulars. Do you type or do you write longhand?
Um, it's a lot of longhand. I always people say, "What's your secret?" And I say, "Well, I just use the blood of a pelican, and I use the toenail of Dostoevsky, and I just do my little." But the reality is, Ted Hughes, the poet, warns you. He says, "Be careful writing on a computer because the neatness of the Word document makes you immediately look like you're more organized than you actually are." Allow the scribble, allow the chaos. What happened to me is for years I used computers, and when I went back to writing again. I could barely write.
Yeah,
My
yeah, yeah.
hand had like disavowed itself of its ancestral job. Um, Incredible. So yeah, I do a lot of writing now, and then I type it up as
Uh,
part of the process.
yeah, yeah. Do you edit on print or do you edit on your writing?
No, I edit on the computer. I
Okay.
edit on the computer. I don't know why. It all kind of brings it into sharp focus. And so that's how I do that. I don't think I'm giving the game away with a lot of writers I know kind of set themselves a discipline where they say, I will write 1,000 words a day. Like,
Yeah,
I just
yeah,
will do that.
yeah.
That's fine. I can oscillate between writing much more than that and much less. But just to keep re-emphasizing, don't fetishize imagination over fidelity. You just got to kind of keep turning up. Imagination in my little petri dish of the internet, that's a very hot word.
Yeah.
But another word that's important for me as an oral storyteller is memory and retention, and how it's so interesting in oral cultures what we choose to remember. It was an act. You had to make a conscious act to decide to remember things before we started writing everything down. So if I'm going to write a book with a lot of stories in, I will tell those stories orally for about a year because you will get seduced by your own scrawl, by your own writing. I
Yeah.
always say look for compression. In every sentence, there's usually two words you don't need. So read a bit of Hemingway, the short, sharp shock of Hemingway, and usually compression is a very good thing.
Talk to me about now you mentioned Substack and I've
Yeah.
Substack is a very new child and it could go terribly wrong. Many children of the internet have died very young lives, and Substack could follow in that tradition. But the publishing industry is also completely disrupted by the internet. Books have been disrupted by the internet. Now, Penguin, of course, is one of these. Penguin is, having a book done by Penguin is sort of like getting an invitation to Harvard. It's one of these names that's above many other names. Yet, even so, even though, on one hand, you might imagine that your mother would love to have a son who has a book out by Penguin. Anybody under the age of 30 today would just say Penguin is a flightless bird in the Antarctic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so what do you see happening in the publishing industry, and how are you approaching this?
Well, I mean, you're exactly right, and you're kind of in a way mirroring the point I was just making about Peugeot and yourself. It's like, listen, you have a good thing going already, so unless it's emotionally important to you, don't feel you don't have to be a writer anymore. You don't
Yeah.
have to communicate like that. Um, I don't know I don't think it's a little bit like vinyl, isn't it? Records, vinyl. Like we thought they'd gone away, but there's such beauty just has a habit of resurfacing. So I don't think books are ever going to disappear. I have a completely, I mean, look at this. Look at this beautiful book here. It says gypsies, didacoys, and other travelers. And look, that's a guy in a gypsy caravan. Just everything about this book. Let's just check something. There's nothing in the Bible about the afterlife that's quite as convincing for me yet as the smell of the book. That's why I'm such a terrible Christian. I like stuff. I like stuff. So a book, I could send you the PDF of Gypsies, Didacoys, and Other Travelers by Norman N. Dodds. But this is the thing. This book, you put it in your bag with an apple and a flask of whiskey and some chocolate, and you go out walking on the moors and you become windswept and interesting. You meet girls. Girls love books. Women love books.
Yeah, they do.
We Yeah, yeah. It can go. A library can go a long way. That's all I'm saying.
And it's always the librarian, of course, that takes off the glasses and takes the
No, yes, that is a tremendously stirring image. And I remember somebody saying once, I think it was a Christian, said, okay, you've got the deal. You can immediately go to heaven, or you're allowed 50 years wandering around a library reading the books you didn't get to read. And I know without question, I would have to trade it because I just there's so much I like I like a lot, you know. I just love to learn stuff, and yeah,
yeah,
it's wonderful.
yeah. Well,
Anyway,
and the book, I think about this often because very much I don't know if I have a book link. There was a professor of mine at seminary, one of my favorite profs, and he retired and he lived just down the street from my aunt in Grand Rapids, and I visited him once, and he was such a gnome. He was such a funny guy. And he just looked at me. He said, I'd like to write a book, but I just don't know if I can hold my attention that long because there's something about I often tell people too when people they see what I do on the internet, oh, they want to do this too, and I always tell them, I say, in a lot of ways, if you want to do this thing. um you'll be happy you did this thing even if absolutely nobody watched the darn thing, because you needed to do this thing because, and for me, it's I needed to get words out of my head, just like you described. And
mm,
unless I can get a little distance from me, and of course I've learned that with sermons, I put something down and then I got to come back to it. So, oh, that's trash. And then you put something out, and then of course like all as you mentioned, all art is abandoned and sermons are abandoned because it's Sunday and you get up there and this is what I got, folks. This is what I got. And may God have mercy on all of us. But I think there still is something about the book that is it's a thing, and it won't be denied. And even as we have PDFs and Kindles, and even as we have Substacks, it's sort of like a marathon. I mean, why would
yeah.
anybody take up marathon running these days? But yet people do. And
Okay, so let's go back to something you said 48 hours ago, which was the notion that if we're not careful, we're going to get to heaven, and St. Peter will say, I'm sorry, you smell of the internet. You smell of the internet. Well, I think here we go. Here's my idea in the moment that the more you smell of books, you might, he might go, okay, we'll give you another chance. You're a sort of Christian, but we'll, come over here.
hmm,
Have you got that book on gypsies, Didacoys, and other travelers? You have? Or is that a first edition? Says St. Peter. It's pretty good, man. So I just think there's a credibility about it. It's some things never go out of style somehow. That's it's I often talk in myth about what makes a compelling story is a combination of the timeless and the time bound.
yeah,
Here's the thing. In Hermes, let's go back to Hermes for a minute. Hermes is in love with the productions of time. He's in love with he's in love with our lives because in Greek myth, the gods don't have pathos because they'll never die. We have pathos because we do die. And so the gods will always be slightly in awe of us because there's so much freighted in our few years
hmm,
that they can never access because they go on and they go on and they go on and they go on. So the timeless and the time bound, when I say timeless, it's those kind of perennial wisdom ideas. We've all 20, there's nothing new in the crisis we're currently in. And so what you need at that moment is timeless information, but is threaded into the conditions of our particular turmoil, whether that's AI or the internet or whatever. It's that combination that creates enough tension to keep your interest. That's why you watch the video on the YouTube. It's bricolage. It's the contact sport of the timeless and the time bound. They come together and shit happens. And in a few years, it'll change again, isn't it? You've been talking recently about somehow a feeling that whatever was going on with Jordan Peterson a few years ago, it shifted. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
quite hard. It's not that easy. Was it overexposure? What was it? Here's a phrase that should haunt you as a pastor. It's from again the poet Robert Bly. He says, "The energy has left the wine."
Hmm.
And this is the second line. He says, "The energy has left the wine, and the pastor slips as he leaves the church."
Wow.
That's poetry. That's what
Yeah.
poetry does. That's
Yeah.
what prose can't do. That's
Yeah.
what there's such a scarcity of with all the talking heads that we listen to all day long. The
Yeah.
energy has left the wine. And I have no idea. I don't know Jordan Peterson stuff well enough to say that.
Yeah.
I do know him though.
Yeah.
You know, I'm one of the, I've got here. Have you ever heard of Gabba Mate?
No. Oh yeah, yeah,
Gabba,
yeah,
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 yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Gabba Mate.
yeah.
I've got Gabba and Jordan on speed dial, on my phone. And now those are two, they're probably two of the most famous Canadians who are probably not talking to each other. But he's a very honest man, Jordan
Yeah.
Peterson.
Yeah.
You
Yeah, he
meet him,
is.
you know it in a second.
Yeah.
There is no fib
Nope.
within 50 yards of
Nope.
that
Nope.
guy's radius.
Nope.
However you react to it,
Yep.
he's not pulling any wool over any
Nope.
eyes.
Nope.
He's not.
Nope. That's exactly right. And people don't I say that to people. I've met him a few times. Um and people are saying, oh, he's a grifter. It's like there's no grift in Jordan.
Oh no, no.
You can say a lot of other things about him, but there's no grift in him. He really is who he is. He is probably one of the most earnest men I've ever met. Um, and yet, I think you said it well. It's also, I mean, this is we like to imagine that human beings are these standalone things, and we never are. And
No,
so part of
no,
what
no.
happened with Jordan from 2016 to 2020 was that the man and the moment met
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
whoosh, it happened. And and then, I remember reading someplace that, people thought you know, by the 1950s that C.S. Lewis's moment had come and gone. And in some ways it
Yeah.
had. And it doesn't mean that we only have one moment to us because, you look at someone like Augustine of Hippo. How many moments has that guy had? And so we are not anything like we imagine ourselves to be, especially in the modern period where we imagine that we are contained by this skin and this hair and these clothing. We are certainly not. And so for someone like Jordan, who knows? Who knows?
Oh yeah. You would it's yeah. Yeah. No, there's all sorts of things. I'm trying to actually self-edit a little bit as I have my thoughts. No, you would be very, very foolish to think that that man has sort of gone off the boil forever. I've no idea what he's up to. I mean, I wonder, bar doing Revelation, I wonder if he's sort of taken the Bible experiment about as far. I'm just not
Yeah,
enjoying it anymore. I'm
yeah,
simply not enjoying it.
yeah,
But I'd love to be, I'm not petitioning for a place at the top table, but we could talk about the Odyssey. We could talk about, you see, it's sorry to break it to you, it's not just the Bible that underpins Western culture. There's this. I was talking to a woman recently, and she said, "Oh yeah, the Greeks got up to a few things." And I was like, "Yes, the Greeks definitely got up to a few things." Isn't it amazing to think that the Jesus, born very near or really on the Silk Road, could have sat there and heard the Odyssey as a
yeah,
young man? It's just the
yeah,
most spine tingling.
yeah,
But I would love to see him move into fairy tales, into myths, into that stuff, because we all know he endlessly petitions for Carl Jung and the rest of it. That would be it would just be a great place for him to go, but maybe he's not interested. I don't know.
yeah. Well, and we are all human beings, and that means that part of the deceit of these two-dimensional screens that we are viewing each other through and others will view us through is that they hide far more than they reveal. And one of
Yeah.
the things, again, you learn as you sit down, because being a pastor basically means watching a small group of people and engaging them, and you very quickly realize that, oh, when you sit down with another human being, there are there are
Oh, yeah.
games within games within games, whether or not the people know, just as you said earlier in this, in terms of the wound and our
Mm.
covering. And so we don't.
Yeah.
And one of the things you learn, again, I loved. Have you ever heard of Eugene Peterson?
Of course. Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Peterson was such a mentor to many pastors my age because he sort of helped, slow people down and helped give even Protestant clergy a gardening metaphor to help people realize that, the life that is in us is not from us. And as a
That's it.
pastor, you sit there in the middle of the garden, and every now and then you might have to do a little pruning, but it is God doing all this work, and you just want to be helpful.
Yeah. I realize now that, I first heard of you not through Jordan. It was you did a thing on Mark Driscoll.
Yeah, yeah.
And Driscoll's now he's a card, as we'd say in England.
Yes, yes.
Driscoll's a card. Let's not do that today. Let's not do Mark Driscoll today. But that would be a world I would be very, very familiar with. And Driscoll had his moment. He
Yes,
definitely,
yes,
Driscoll for a period of time was a truth teller.
yeah,
And he
yeah,
was a bomb that would go off at any moment in the most complacent of conferences. And he's a volatile combination,
yeah,
not quite my flavor, but that doesn't mean I don't recognize the shape of him.
yep,
But
yep,
that was it. That you did a few episodes on Driscoll. I thought,
yeah,
now if I ever meet that guy, that's going to be interesting because that's a world. My brother is a pastor, New
yeah,
Frontiers pastor.
yeah,
This
yeah,
is a world we're extremely familiar with.
yeah,
And then you collared me in London a couple
yeah,
of years ago,
yeah,
and I was
yeah,
like, oh, there you are, man.
yeah. Well, God has populated this world with so many interesting creatures, and it is a blessing. The life that He gives us is a profound blessing, and yeah, yeah. I don't know. That's what I got. You got anything? You got anything else you wanted to talk about, or do we land the plane now?
No, I think we probably land the plane now. As I say, forgive me for not mentioning it yet. Liturgies of the Wild, the myths that make us. It's a Christian way into the unrelenting mythologies of our time, and quite
Yeah.
what you could do with them, what you could do with them.
And
So
when is this expected to
it's
see?
out very early in the new year, but
Okay.
I'll be talking about it through the autumn for sure. Hopefully there'll be a lot of talks and work in the States
Yeah.
because it's the New York office of Penguin that signed me. And I'm really excited about it. It's the best thing I've ever done. So I'll finish with this. Some books are a bridge, some are a leap. The leap books I write sell nothing, nothing. The bridge books are popular. This is a bridge, but it's
Okay.
not a compromised bridge. It's a bridge just recognizing we do live in a sort of in a Hermean moment of a way. And I think I've never had these process of thoughts before. I hope in my own tiny way, I'm trying to discern, as Paul tells us to do, the spirits of the age. I'm trying to go, okay, let's look at this. Is this a story that is ultimately redemptive? Because if it
Yeah.
isn't, let's leave it over there. But if
Yeah.
it is, maybe it's got something to say to us.
Yeah. And will you do an audiobook for this?
Without question.
Oh,
Yeah.
good, good,
Yeah, yeah,
good.
yeah. And if anybody's interested or the way into what I'm up to would be to go on to Audible or something like it. There's a book, Courting the Wild Twin, another book, Smoke Hole. But if you want to go out where the buses don't park, if you want the undistilled Dr. Shaw adventure, get the audio of a book called Bard's Skull. Now, Bard's Skull, that's 10 hours. I did it, I think, in one sit. Yeah, I think I did it in one sit and take a long journey out into the desert, into the Mojave or somewhere like that, and just have that rattling around and see where you go from it. Send me a postcard, you know.
And do the good people at Audible or Penguin, do they allow you to wander from the text, or must you stick to it
Oh no, no,
precisely?
no, 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 no. It's precise. And there'll be Mr. Shaw, could we just go back, please? So you go back and you do it again and you do it again. So no, it's not like the rather psychedelic Substack that I have where I go wandering. Storytellers, you see, when we talk naturally, we go from first to third person, and we go back, and that's all part of the joy of orality. And it's the stuff that editors try and comb out.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
sometimes I have to find, so no, leave that in there. I'm kind of pugilistic. I'm like a little boxer like that. Let me dwell in my Irishness. Let me dwell in my circle. Stop trying to stretch me into a longship all the time. That's a beautiful thing to go through this world, but I'm different, you know.
yeah, yeah. All right, Martin. Well, I will end the recording, but while the recording is on, I will say thank you so much for this and for our Monday recording and for your friendship, because you have certainly brought me much joy, and for as long as the Lord gives us, I hope He continues to bring me that joy.
Thank you, Paul.